humble, kind of inconspicuous letter. I'd like to kind of give you a summary of it and draw a couple of conclusions from it. Some of you probably saw the movie St. Paul the Apostle with Jim Caviezel that came out about 4 months ago. If you saw that, you'll understand this letter better. Because you saw that movie in which St. Paul was there talking with St. Luke, and eventually at the very end, St. Paul was decapitated at the very end, the last scene. Some of the letters of St. Paul are called the captivity letters. When you say captivity letters, you probably say, what the heck is that, Father? St. Paul was actually in jail when he was writing some of the letters. Among which the most famous would be the most developed theological treatise, almost in the Bible, the letter to the Romans, where he'd eventually end his life and he'll be decapitated in the time of Nero. But another letter that he wrote, as you heard today, he's an old man, he's writing a letter to Philemon. Some of you are probably thinking, who the heck is this Philemon guy? Okay, Philemon was the owner of the slave that you heard, whose name was Onesimus. Now, if you know language well, Onesimus, his name means useless. Okay, and there's kind of like a play on words where St. Paul says, he may have been useless to you, but he certainly is useful to me. Mm-hmm. So St. Paul is using a little bit of humor there. So what happened is Onesimus, who is the slave of Philemon, he's escaped. Okay, what would Roman law do to a person like this? Death penalty. Death penalty. He'd be killed. Yeah. So as soon as he was discharged, his owner could have had him put to death. The Romans were pretty tough. Pretty tough. They had very strict rules. That's why their empire lasted probably good 700 years. No. So what happens is when he's in jail there, as Paul says, the Word of God cannot be chained. You can chain a person, but you cannot chain the Word of God. I love that. So Paul is not playing tic-tac-toe in prison. He's not playing computer games, no. But rather, didn't have computer games back then anyway, no. St. Paul is preaching the Word of God. So every opportunity that Paul has, he uses to save souls. So what he does is he starts to talk to Onesimus about Christ. Onesimus opens his heart, receives Christ, and then he baptizes him. That's why Paul says that he is his father. He's not his biological father, obviously, but he's his spiritual father. It's a beautiful letter. So Paul is writing this letter to Philemon so that Philemon will be merciful to his slave Onesimus. He won't chastise him, much less kill him. So it's basically a plea for mercy. That's what it is. It's a plea for mercy. There's a lot of sub-themes there. Slavery, spiritual paternity, mercy, kindness, preaching the Word of God in season, out season. I could probably develop easily 5 different topics just on this short letter. So you know what the church does? The church is basically cut out and given you a summary of the whole letter. Well, you might go home and read it tonight. I think it's a charming little letter. And the essence is that of mercy. Paul is begging, he's begging Philemon to be merciful. And listen, not to see Onesimus as a slave, but to see him as a son. That's the message. That's the message. No longer an owner-slave relationship, but a father-son relationship, even though technically he's still going to be a slave. Now, Philemon, could have given him freedom. We don't know what happens after this letter. We'll find out only once we get to heaven how this drama ended. Okay. All right. Is that clear? Because if you just hear this, what the heck is this Philemon stuff? Unless I give you the whole biblical historical context, the letter's going to go right over your head. Okay? All right. Today we celebrate one of the few saints who's known as the Great. And tomorrow we celebrate one of the very few saints who is a woman who's known as the Great. And there's a church in the Diocese of LA in Bell Gardens in honor of the saint that we celebrate tomorrow. Tomorrow we celebrate Saint Gertrude the Great, who's probably among the three greatest women intellectuals in the church, with Edith Stein and Teresa of Avila. Saint Gertrude the Great is one of the greatest women intellectuals who wrote Herald of Divine Love, which was a promotion of divine mercy and devotion of the Sacred Heart back in the 5th century. But today we celebrate Albert the Great. Okay, there's so much to be said about this great saint, but I'll give you maybe 3 short stories. Albert the Great was the greatest intellect in the world back 800 years ago. Albert the Great was a German, brought up, his father was a military leader. Albert the Great studied at the 2 best universities. It would be the Harvard and the Yale if you speak like an American, or Oxford and Cambridge if you were an Englishman. Okay? At that time, which would be the University of Padua and the University of Paris. Those were the 2 greatest universities back in the 13th century. When he was there, he met an order that was just being founded. It was the order of preachers founded by Dominic Guzman. We call them the Dominicans. And he's so impressed by this young fledgling order in which the founder was still living, that he decided he wanted to become one of them. His father didn't like that at all. You know why? Because these guys would be like the homeless people walk on the street. Buddy, can you spare a dime? I mean, they were mendicant preachers, no? Which was an insult for noble, rich person. It was kind of like an insult. But he decided he was going to do it against his parents' desire, and he became a Dominican priest. Now, as a Dominican priest, he became one of the greatest scholars in the history of the world. And he did something that no priest had ever done yet. Albert the Great was an expert in biology, in geography, in metaphysics, in philosophy, in theology. All the human branches of knowledge, he was an expert. He was a walking encyclopedia of knowledge. And his expertise was this. Before that time, there was a certain disjuncture or separation between faith and reason. But what he taught is that human knowledge is not going to be an impediment to arriving at God, but rather a bridge to God. And if you want the most important encyclical that's been written in the past 30 years, Fides Ratio of John Paul II. Okay? If any of you are theologians or scholars, Fides Ratio of John Paul II would be Albert the Great today, in which faith and reason do not contradict each other. Okay? Faith and reason, they do not contradict each other. However, faith does not contradict reason, but it transcends reason. That's the expertise of St. Albert the Great. Biology, physics, chemistry, geography are branches of knowledge that, if used well, are a means by which we can arrive at God. And if any of you study biology or physics or chemistry, if you look at the laws that are present there, behind those laws is the Creator. Something as simple, you look at an ant in the series of ants walking to the anthill, carrying a little piece of bread. Obviously that comes from God. That order, the harmony of these ants, better formed almost than the American army. No? So behind that order is the Creator Himself. God is the one that orders the universe. Okay, I'd like to tell you two other stories of this saint. He was teaching seminarians, and there was a very big seminarian who was very quiet. And the other seminarians would poke fun at him because he was big, kind of chubby, stocky, and the other seminarians would talk a lot, but he was very taciturn. He weighed his words before he spoke, and they gave him a kind of an ugly name. They called him a dumb ox. How would you like if I called you a dumb ox? You wouldn't come back next week. That was an insult. But Albert the Great said this: "You call him a dumb ox, his bellows will be heard throughout the whole world." The name of that dumb ox, G.K. Chesterton wrote a work on the dumb ox, and his name is Thomas Aquinas. His bellows will be heard through the whole universe. I find that fascinating. Albert the Great was the greatest intellect in the world, but his student would go way beyond him. Thomas Aquinas obviously is the greatest intellect we have in the Catholic Church, if not the whole world. But God gave him the greatest of teachers. The greatest of teachers. Now look at the humility of this man. He's a first-class intellectual. He's a born teacher. So he's called to be the provincial of the Dominicans. Didn't really want to do it, he accepted. And he's called to be a bishop. Didn't want to do it, accepted it. I really admire that. He's very much like Romero, who was canonized about 2 months ago. Have any of you heard of Oscar Romero, who was canonized by the Pope? Romero was an intellectual. He didn't want to be a bishop. Romero wanted to stay with his books. If you saw the movie Romero, he was an intellectual, he was a professor, he was a writer, he was a theologian, exactly like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas. But God wanted to pull him out of his comfort zone so that he could be one of the best bishops in the Catholic Church and the best religious in the Catholic Church. But I've saved my favorite story for last. Now, the story I'm going to tell you right now is going to be a shocker, but just to see how God works. Very much related to what we're going to be doing after Mass. This you can read in the Lives of the Saints by Padre Salisman if you read Spanish, okay? But I'll translate it into English. When Albert was young, he hated school. You know why? Because he couldn't learn. He had learning disabilities. So one day, he wanted to play hooky. So he was trying to play hooky to run away from school. And he's climbing up a ladder. Just to give up on school. In the top of the ladder, guess who we saw? The Blessed Virgin Mary. She said to him, "Where are you going, Al?" "Al, where are you going?" He said, "I can't put up with this school stuff anymore. I can't learn." And she said, "Why didn't you ask me?" "Can I ask you?" "Of course you can." He said, "Mary, help me to learn." From that moment on, he was turned into a genius. The greatest intellect in the world before Thomas Aquinas. And it all came through the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So if you have any trouble with your studies, you know who to go to. If you're struggling with math or physics or chemistry, you know who to go to, right? Mary can work so many miracles. So I hope and I pray that you really fall in love with the saints. I really hope and you pray you fall in love with the saints. The Beatles used to sing, "Get a little help from my friends," okay? Remember that? Let's baptize Paul McCartney's song into a Catholic song, okay? Get a little help from my friends, and those can be the saints. And Mary is the queen of all the saints. Amen. Amen.